The crack of the slap echoed through the marble foyer, a sharp, violent sound that seemed to shatter the very air. My head snapped to the side, the force of the blow sending a searing heat blooming across my left cheek. I stumbled, my shoulder hitting the cold edge of a console table, sending a crystal vase of white lilies crashing to the floor. Water and shattered glass sprayed across my bare feet, but I didn't feel the cuts. I only felt the silence. I stayed there, frozen, my hair shielding my eyes. The scent of the house, usually a comforting blend of expensive sandalwood and rain, now felt like a chokehold. It was Damien's scent, his alpha pheromones flooding the room, thick and oppressive, designed to dominate and subdue. "How dare you?" Damien's voice was a low growl, vibrating in his chest. It wasn't the voice he used when he whispered against my neck in the dead of night. This was the voice of the CEO, the man who broke companies and crushed rivals without a second thought. I slowly turned my gaze toward him. Damien stood tall, his tailored charcoal suit impeccable, his jaw clenched tight. Beside him, clinging to his arm with a trembling hand, was Leo. Leo was a delicate thing, a pale, wide-eyed omega with a scent like crushed jasmine and innocence. He looked terrified, his lip quivering, a single tear tracking down his cheek. He looked like a broken bird, the kind of creature that demanded protection. "I didn't mean to, Damien," Leo whimpered, his voice a fragile thread. "Ethan he said such horrible things about my work. I was only trying to help with the merger files." I looked at Leo. I looked past the trembling lip and the fox stare. For a split second, the mask slipped. In the reflection of the polished marble floor, I saw it, a tiny, triumphant curve of Leo's lips, a predator's smile. Then, the world tilted. It started as a flicker, a flash of a gray ceiling and the smell of antiseptic. Then, a roar of memories that didn't belong to this moment. It felt more real than the floor beneath my feet. I saw myself, not here, but then. I remembered a cold hospital room where the heaters have failed. I remembered the agony of a labor that went wrong, the feeling of a tiny life slipping away before I could even hear its first cry. I remembered the crushing weight of loneliness, the way I had begged Damien, a different version of him, yet the same cold heart, to come to me. I remembered the phone call. "I don't have time for your hysterics, Ethan. Leo is dealing with a crisis at the office. Stop being so needy." I remembered the frame-up, the forged documents that made me look like a traitor to the Ashford Empire. I remembered the way Damien had looked at me when he threw the divorce papers on the bed, not with anger, but with a devastating, hollow indifference. He had discarded me like a piece of spoiled fruit. I remembered the end, the slow fade of light in a dingy apartment, my body wasted away by illness and grief, dying alone, while the man I had worshipped lived in a golden tower with the man who had orchestrated my ruin. I gasped, my lungs seizing as the visions receded, leaving behind a residue of ancient, suffocating pain. The shock of the memory acted like a catalyst, burning away the blind devotion I had carried for Damien for years. I looked at the man standing before me, the man who had just struck me to protect a liar, and I felt a sudden, jarring clarity. The love I felt for him didn't vanish. It simply curdled. It turned into something cold and heavy, a stone in my gut. "Are you deaf, Ethan?" Damien demanded, stepping forward. His shadow loomed over me, blocking out the light of the chandelier. "Apologize to Leo. Now." I didn't move. I didn't cry. The tears that usually flowed the moment Damien raised his voice simply refused to come. "I won't," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. It wasn't the shaky, pleading tone of the omega who lived for his husband's approval. It was flat, empty. Damien paused, his brow furrowing. He wasn't used to resistance. I had spent 3 years being the perfect spouse, the quiet support, the one who cooked his favorite meals, the one who waited up until 3 in the morning just to kiss him hello. "What did you say?" I said. "I won't apologize," I replied, finally straightening my back. I ignored the sting in my cheek and the blood trickling from a cut on my toe. "Because he is lying, and because you are too blind to see it." Damien's eyes darkened, the gold of his alpha iris flashing. He reached out, grabbing my wrist in a grip that threatened to bruise. "You've become arrogant, Ethan. Perhaps you've forgotten who provides everything for you. This house, your clothes, your very status, it all comes from me." I looked down at his hand on my wrist. It felt like a shackle. In my past life, I would have apologized. I would have fallen to my knees and begged for his forgiveness, terrified that he would leave me. I would have convinced myself that his violence was just a manifestation of his passion, or that I deserved it for not being enough. But the ghost of the man who died alone was screaming in my ear. "You're right," I whispered. "It does all come from you." I yanked my arm back with a sudden, violent strength that surprised both of us. Damien blinked, startled by the lack of submission in my scent. The sweetness of my amiga pheromones had vanished, replaced by something sharp and sterile. I turned and walked away from them, leaving the shattered lilies and the stunned alpha behind. I didn't go to the bedroom to hide. I went to the study. The study was Damien's sanctuary, a room of dark mahogany and leather that smelled of power. On the desk sat a folder of the prenuptial agreement and the standard divorce clauses he had insisted upon when we married, just in case things didn't work out. He had never thought they wouldn't. He assumed I was his for life, a loyal pet who would never wander. I pulled a pen from the holder. My hand trembled, not from fear, but from a simmering, quiet rage. I read through the terms. He kept the house. He kept the primary assets. I would receive a settlement enough to live comfortably, but not enough to be a threat. In the past, I would have fought for more, or begged him to stay. Now, the money felt like a ransom payment for my freedom. I signed my name in a bold, sweeping script. Ethan Vale. As I pressed the pen to the paper, a sudden wave of nausea rolled over me. I gripped the edge of the desk, my knuckles turning white. A strange, fluttering sensation stirred in the depths of my abdominal warmth, a tiny spark of life that felt entirely separate from the coldness of the room. I froze, my breath catching. I knew this feeling. I remembered it from the other life. I slowly placed a hand over my stomach. I was barely a few weeks along. I didn't even know for sure, but the instinct was there, humming under my skin. I looked at the door of the study, knowing Damien was likely still in the foyer, perhaps already comforting Leo. A dark, protective instinct flared within me, shielding the tiny life inside. If I stayed, this child would grow up in a house of shadows. They would learn that love was a transaction, that loyalty was rewarded with a slap, and that the person who was supposed to protect them was the one they should fear most. I would not let history repeat itself. I gathered my things, not the designer bags or the jewelry Damien had bought to mark his territory, but my passport, my birth certificate, and the small stash of personal savings I had managed to keep from my own family's inheritance. I left the signed papers prominently on the center of the desk. I didn't leave a note. A note was a plea for a conversation, and I was done talking. I walked back through the foyer. Damien was standing there, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation. Leo was still tucked under his arm, though the fragile amiga was now watching me with a calculating gaze. "Where are you going?" Damien asked, his voice returning to that commanding tone. "We aren't finished." I stopped a few feet away from him. I didn't look at Leo. I looked directly into Damien's eyes, seeing the man I had loved and the man who had killed me in another world. "We are," I said. I didn't wait for his reaction. I didn't look back to see the moment he realized I wasn't coming back to the bedroom to cry. I simply walked out the front door and stepped into the rain. The cold water drenched my clothes instantly, chilling me to the bone. But for the first time into lifetimes, I felt like I could finally breathe. I hailed a taxi, the tires splashing through the puddles of the affluent neighborhood. As the car pulled away from the Ashford estate, I looked at the sprawling mansion in the rearview mirror. It looked like a mausoleum. I leaned back against the seat and closed my eyes, my hands still resting protectively over my womb. "It's just you and me now," I whispered to the silence. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to be far away. I had to find a place where the sun of sandalwood couldn't reach me, where the shadow of Damien Ashford didn't loom, and where I could learn how to be something other than a discarded omega. The city blurred past in a smudge of neon lights and gray rain. I felt a strange sense of lightness, as if the weight of 1,000 betrayals had finally been lifted from my shoulders. I was broken, yes. My heart was a mosaic of jagged shards. But as the taxi crossed the city limits, heading toward the coast, I realized that shards could be used as weapons. I wasn't the obedient husband anymore. I was a survivor. And this time, I was playing for keeps. The coastal town of Silver Cove did not welcome me with open arms. It greeted me with a biting wind and the relentless, rhythmic drumming of a gray Atlantic. It was a place of jagged cliffs, salt-crusted windows, and people who kept their secrets tucked away like pressed flowers in old books. To the world, I had simply vanished. To Damien, I was likely a tantrum in progress, a spoiled spouse who would eventually crawl back once the reality of a bank account without his signature hit home. He didn't know that I had stripped myself of everything that smelled of him. I found a small, drafty attic apartment above a bakery that smelled eternally of yeast and cinnamon. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and the wallpaper was peeling in long, jaundiced strips. But it was mine. For the first time into lifetimes, the air I breathed didn't belong to someone else. The first few months were a blur of exhaustion and nausea. My body felt like a battlefield. The pregnancy was a quiet, insistent presence, a humming vibration in my lower abdomen that grew stronger with every passing week. Morning sickness wasn't just a morning occurrence. It was a constant companion that left me shaking and pale, clinging to the porcelain rim of the sink while the world spun in dizzying circles. I spent hours sitting by the window, watching the fog roll in from the sea, erasing the horizon. I would place my hand over the slight curve of my belly, feeling a fierce, primal protectiveness that bordered on obsession. In my previous life, I had been too weak to shield my child. I had let the world, and Damien's indifference, seep through the cracks of my resolve. Not this time. I would be the fortress. I would be the wall. I took a job at the local archives, a dusty, silent building where the only company I had were the ghosts of dead mayors and yellowed land deeds. It was the perfect hiding spot. The head archivist, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, didn't care where I came from as long as I filed the records in chronological order and didn't track mud onto her carpets. The silence of the archives was my sanctuary, but the loneliness was a slow-acting poison. There were moments, usually in the blue hour of twilight, when the memory of Damien's touch would flicker in my mind, not the slap, not the coldness, but the ghost of the man I had thought he was. I would feel a phantom warmth against my skin, a longing for the bond that had once anchored me. Then I would remember the look in his eyes when he defended Leo, and the longing would turn into a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. It was a rainy Tuesday in November when the orbit of my life shifted. I was leaving the archives, clutching a stack of fragile folders to my chest, when the wind decided to play a cruel joke. A sudden, violent gust ripped through the street, tearing the folders from my grip. Papers, decades of town history scattered like panicked birds across the wet cobblestones. No, 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 I whispered, scrambling after them. The rain was a curtain of ice, soaking through my thin cardigan in seconds. I dropped to my knees, the cold stone bruising my joints, desperate to gather the documents before the ink ran. I felt dizzy, a wave of vertigo hitting me as I reached for a stray page. The world tilted, the gray sky merging with the gray street, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. Then a pair of sturdy, polished black boots appeared in my field of vision. A large, warm hand reached down, snagging a piece of parchment just as it was about to slide into a gutter. I looked up, squinting through the rain, and found myself staring at a man who looked as if he had been carved from the very cliffs surrounding the town. He was tall, impossibly so, with shoulders that seemed to block out the wind. His hair was a deep, midnight black, dampened by the rain and clinging to a forehead that was currently creased in concern. But it was his eyes that stopped my heart. They were a piercing, intelligent silver, devoid of the oppressive dominance I had associated with alphas. There was a stillness to him, a quiet power that didn't need to roar to be felt. And then there was his scent. It hit me like a physical wave, not the suffocating sandalwood of Damien, but something grounded and ancient. It smelled of cedarwood, rain-dampened earth, and a hint of something spicy, like cloves and old leather. It was a scent that didn't demand submission. It offered shelter. "You're shivering," he said. His voice was a rich baritone, smooth as polished stone, vibrating in the air between us. He didn't reach for me with the possessiveness of a predator. He simply stood there holding the papers, his gaze scanning my pale face and the way I was clutching my stomach. "I'm fine," I lied, my voice trembling. The wind." He didn't argue. Instead, he knelt beside me in the rain, ignoring the way his expensive wool coat soaked up the dirty water of the street. He began to gather the papers with a methodical, gentle efficiency, his movements precise. "The archives are a treasure, but they're a nightmare in a storm," he remarked, a small ghost of a smile touching his lips. I watched him. I watched the way his large fingers handled the delicate paper with surprising tenderness. There was a contrast in him that fascinated me, the raw, alpha strength of his frame paired with the softness in his actions. Once the papers were secured, he stood and offered me his hand. I hesitated, my mind flashing back to the grip Damien had used to bruise my wrist. I flinched, a small, involuntary jerk of my shoulder. The man froze. He didn't look offended or confused. He simply retracted his hand a few inches, giving me space, his silver eyes darkening with a flicker of understanding. He didn't ask why I flinched. He didn't demand an explanation. He just stepped back, creating a safe perimeter around me. "My car is just there," he said, gesturing to a sleek, dark SUV idling at the curb. "I can drive you home. You're white as a sheet, and the temperature is dropping." "I can walk," I whispered, though the thought of the 3-block trek in the freezing rain felt like a death sentence. "It's a short drive, and I'm a very boring companion," he replied, his tone light, almost teasing. "I promise not to kidnap you. I'm Adrian." I didn't know who Adrian Knight was. Not then. I didn't know that in the corporate world, his name was spoken with a mixture of reverence and terror. I didn't know that he was the only man capable of making Damien Ashford lose sleep at night. All I knew was that his scent was making the nausea in my stomach subside, replaced by a strange, humming warmth. "Ethan," I replied. The drive to my apartment was quiet. Adrian didn't pepper me with questions. He didn't try to fill the silence with meaningless chatter. He simply drove, the heater in the car blasting a comforting warmth that thawed the ice in my bones. I leaned my head against the window, watching the raindrops race each other down the glass, feeling the baby kick for the first time, a tiny, fluttering sensation that made my breath hitch. When he dropped me off at the bakery, he didn't try to follow me inside. He waited until I had my key in the lock. "Thank you, Adrian," I said, turning back to him. He looked at me, his silver eyes searching mine. For a moment, I felt as if he could see everything: the scars on my heart, the secret in my womb, the ghost of the man I had left behind. But he didn't pry. He simply nodded. "Take care of yourself, Ethan. And maybe buy a sturdier briefcase." I watched him drive away, the red taillights of his car disappearing into the mist. For the first time since I had arrived in Silver Cove, the loneliness didn't feel like a poison. It felt like a space that was finally starting to fill. Over the next few weeks, Adrian became a recurring character in my quiet life. He appeared at the archives under the guise of researching local land grants, but we both knew the archives were a bore. He would bring me things: small, thoughtful gestures that felt like seismic shifts in my world. One day, it was a thermos of ginger tea to help with the nausea. Another day, it was a book of poetry by Neruda, with a note tucked inside that simply said, "For the quietest person in the room." He never pushed. He never demanded my time or my history. He existed on the periphery of my life, a steady, grounding presence. He would walk me to my apartment, keeping a respectful distance, talking about the architecture of the town or the way the light changed over the bay in December. I found myself craving his company. I craved the way he listened, really listened when I spoke. When I mentioned that I liked the smell of the sea, he didn't just nod. He took me to a hidden cliffside path where the salt spray hit your face and the world felt infinite. One afternoon, as we sat on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the ocean, the silence between us shifted. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the silence of two people who had found a shared frequency. "You're glowing," Adrian said softly. I stiffened, my hand instinctively moving to cover my stomach. I was wearing an oversized sweater, but as the pregnancy progressed, the bump was becoming harder to hide. I felt a surge of panic. Would he judge me? Would he see me as broken or burdened? Adrian didn't move closer, but his scent intensified, warm, protective, and profoundly gentle. "I can smell it," he whispered. "The scent of a new life. It's beautiful." Tears pricked my eyes, blurring the horizon. I had spent months terrified of this secret, treating my pregnancy like a vulnerability that could be used against me. But in Adrian's voice, there was no judgment. There was only a quiet, shimmering reverence. "It's my only thing," I choked out, the words escaping before I could stop them. "The only thing that's truly mine." Adrian finally moved. He reached out, his hand hovering just an inch above mine on my stomach. He waited, his silver eyes asking for permission. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw a man who didn't want to own me. He wanted to support me. I nodded slowly. He placed his palm against the fabric of my sweater. His hand was huge, covering nearly half of my belly. The moment he touched me, I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through my spine. The baby reacted instantly, delivering a sharp, strong kick right against his palm. Adrian's eyes widened. A look of pure, unadulterated wonder crossed his face, a vulnerability that stripped away the image of the powerful alpha. He let out a soft, breathless laugh. "Hello there," he whispered to my stomach. I began to cry. They weren't the jagged, heartbroken sobs I had known for years. They were a release, a purging of the grief and the fear that had lived in my marrow. I leaned into him, and for the first time, I let someone hold me. Adrian wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into the broad expanse of his chest. He smelled of cedar and safety. He didn't tell me that everything would be okay, because he knew that life didn't work that way. Instead, he just held me, his chin resting on the top of my head, his heartbeat a steady, rhythmic drum that drowned out the echoes of the past. "I've got you," he murmured into my hair. "You don't have to carry it all alone anymore." In the shelter of his arms, I felt the last remnants of the obedient Omega wither and die. I wasn't a possession. I wasn't a mistake. I was a person, and I was loved not for what I could provide, but for who I was. As the weeks turned into months, Adrian became the center of my universe. He didn't just accompany me to doctor visits. He researched the best prenatal vitamins and argued with the clinic about the quality of their ultrasound machines. He cooked for me, learning which foods triggered my nausea and which ones made me feel strong. He spent evenings reading to me and the baby, his deep voice a lullaby that chased away the nightmares of hospital rooms and cold indifference. He never asked about the father. He never asked why I had fled to a remote coastal town with nothing but a suitcase and a shattered heart. He simply created a world where those questions didn't matter. One evening, as we lay on the sofa in my small apartment, the fire crackling in the hearth, Adrian traced the line of my jaw with his thumb. "You're so strong, Ethan," he whispered. "I don't feel strong," I admitted, leaning into his touch. "I feel like I've spent my whole life breaking." "The strongest things are often the ones that have been broken and put back together," he replied, his gaze intense. "The seams are where the light gets in." I looked at him, and for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future. A future where I didn't have to look over my shoulder. A future where my child would know a father who was gentle, who was present, and who loved without conditions. But as the winter began to thaw, and the first primroses appeared in the gardens of Silver Cove, a cold dread began to seep back into my bones. I knew that Damien Ashford was not a man who let things go. He was a collector of things, and I had been his favorite piece. He might have been arrogant enough to think I would return, but he was also a predator. Predators eventually get bored of waiting. They start to hunt. I didn't know that in the city, Damien was staring at the signed divorce papers on his desk. The ink now faded, but the memory of my departure still raw. I didn't know that he had spent the last year in a state of simmering, possessive rage, his confidence cracking as the months passed and I remained silent. I didn't know that he had finally hired the best private investigators in the country, and that a single, grainy photograph of me laughing in Adrian Knight's arms had just landed on his mahogany desk. I only knew that as I looked up at Adrian, the man who had saved me, I felt a surge of terror. I wanted to protect this piece. I wanted to shield Adrian and the baby from the storm that was inevitably coming. "What is it?" Adrian asked, noticing the sudden tension in my shoulders. I leaned up and kissed him a slow, desperate kiss that tasted of salt and longing. I poured everything into it, my gratitude, my fear, and the burgeoning, fierce love I felt for him. "Nothing," I lied, pulling away with a small, sad smile. "I just love you." Adrian smiled back, his silver eyes glowing with a warmth that could melt the coldest winter. He pulled me back down against him, his hand resting protectively over our child. "I love you too, Ethan, and I promise you, no one is ever going to hurt you again." As I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs outside, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the past was dead and buried. But deep down, in the place where the memories of my previous life still whispered, I knew that the bill for my freedom was finally coming due. And Damien Ashford always collected his debts. The birth of my son did not happen in a sterile, white-walled room where the air tasted of bleach and indifference. It happened in the heart of a coastal storm, with the Atlantic screaming against the cliffs of Silver Cove and the wind rattling the window panes of Adrian's house, a sprawling stone cottage that had become the only true home I had ever known. The labor was a slow, agonizing descent into a world of fire and pressure. For hours, I was nothing more than a collection of nerve endings, my body twisting and folding under the weight of contractions that felt like tectonic plates shifting inside my pelvis. I remember the smell of the room lavender oil and the grounding, heavy scent of cedarwood that clung to Adrian's skin. In my previous life, I had been alone. I remembered the coldness of the hospital sheets, the way the nurses looked at me with pity, and the crushing, suffocating silence of a phone that refused to ring. I remembered the moment I realized the baby was gone, a void opening in my chest that never truly closed. But this time, there was a hand in mine. Adrian never left my side. He didn't panic, and he didn't tell me to be strong. He simply existed as my anchor. When the pain became a blinding white light, he was there, his voice a low, steady hum against my ear, guiding my breath, whispering promises of a future I had never dared to imagine. He wiped the sweat from my brow with a damp cloth, his silver eyes filled with a devotion so fierce it felt like a physical shield. "Just a little more, Ethan," he whispered, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "He's almost here. You're doing it. You're bringing him home." When the final, shattering push came. I felt a sensation of tearing and release, a visceral, raw explosion of effort that left me gasping for air. And then, the sound. A sharp, piercing cry that sliced through the roar of the storm outside. The midwife placed the small, warm, slippery weight of him against my chest. He was red-faced and screaming, his tiny fingers curling instinctively into the fabric of my gown. I looked down at him, my son, and I felt a wave of love so potent it was terrifying. It was a love that didn't ask for anything in return, a love that was pure and uncomplicated. Noah, I whispered, my voice a broken thread. His name is Noah. Adrian leaned over us, his large hand resting gently on my shoulder, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. He looked at the baby, then at me, and in that moment, the bond between us shifted. We weren't just broken people, clinging to each other in a storm. We were a family. The months that followed were a haze of midnight feedings, the sweet, milky scent of a newborn, and the profound, quiet joy of watching a human being grow. Noah was a miracle of soft curves and sleepy sighs. He had my eyes, but he had a certain stillness to him that reminded me of Adrian. As my body healed, the tenderness between Adrian and I evolved. It was no longer just about protection and comfort. It was a slow-burning fire, a hunger that had been suppressed by the fragility of the pregnancy and the exhaustion of early parenthood. We moved through the house like celestial bodies caught in each other's gravity, always finding a way to touch a hand on the small of the back, a kiss pressed to the temple, the lingering brush of shoulders in the kitchen. One rainy afternoon, while Noah was sound asleep in his crib, the tension that had been building between us finally snapped. It started in the living room, the fire casting long, amber shadows across the wooden floor. Adrian was standing behind me, his arms wrapping around my waist, pulling my back against the hard planes of his chest. I could feel the heat of him, the rhythmic thrum of his heart beating against my spine. His scent, that intoxicating blend of cedar and rain, was thick in the air, triggering a deep, primal ache in my core. He leaned down, his lips grazing the sensitive skin of my neck. I let out a soft, shaky moan, my head falling back against his shoulder. "I've wanted you for so long," he murmured, his voice a dark, velvet caress. He turned me around in his arms, his silver eyes burning with a hunger that made my knees weak. When his mouth met mine, it wasn't the tentative kiss of our early days. It was a claim. His tongue swept into my mouth, tasting of mint and desire, sucking on my lower lip with a possessive intensity that sent a jolt of electricity straight to my groin. I reached up, my fingers tangling in his thick, dark hair, pulling him closer as if I could merge our bodies into one. He groaned into the kiss, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through my entire frame. With a fluid motion, he lifted me, my legs instinctively wrapping around his waist. He carried me to the bedroom, the door clicking shut behind us, shutting out the rest of the world. He laid me back against the cool sheets, his large body hovering over mine, a mountain of muscle and warmth. He began to strip me, his movements slow and deliberate. He peeled away my shirt, his eyes roaming over my chest with a reverence that made me feel like a masterpiece. When he reached my nipples, he leaned down, his tongue swirling around the peak before taking the entire butt into his mouth. I arched my back, a sharp gasp escaping my lips as he sucked hard, the sensation sending ripples of pleasure crashing through me. "You are so beautiful, Ethan," he whispered, his breath hot against my skin. He moved down, his hand sliding over the curve of my hips, the skin there still soft from the pregnancy. He stripped away my trousers and underwear, leaving me bare and trembling beneath him. He spent a long time just looking at me, his gaze lingering on the faint, silvery stretch marks on my stomach, the maps of where Noah had grown. He leaned down and kissed each one, his lips soft and lingering, turning my insecurities into sacred ground. When he finally stripped off his own clothes, I saw him in his full, imposing glory. He was a masterpiece of an alpha, broad shoulders, a lean waist, and a cock that was thick and heavy, already leaking a bead of clear pre-cum at the tip. The sight of him made my mouth go dry, my own heat pooling between my thighs. He moved between my legs, his knees prying them wide. He didn't go for the kill immediately. Instead, he leaned down, his tongue finding the sensitive nub of my clit. I cried out, my fingers digging into the sheets as he began to lick me with a rhythmic, swirling precision. He used his fingers to open me, sliding one, then two, into my tight, wet heat. The sound of it, the wet, schlicking noise of his fingers sliding in and out of me, filled the room. I was drenched, my natural lubrication mixing with his saliva, creating a slick, squelching friction that drove me to the brink of madness. "Please," I whimpered, my hips bucking upward. "Adrian, please." He looked up at me, his silver eyes dark with lust. He gripped my thighs, pulling me to the edge of the bed, and positioned the head of his cock against my entrance. He paused for a heartbeat, ensuring I was ready, before he pushed forward in one slow, relentless thrust. I let out a strangled scream, my eyes rolling back in my head as he filled me completely. He was so large, so thick, and I felt every ridge of him stretching me to my limit. The sensation of being filled, truly filled, was overwhelming. It wasn't the aggressive, dominating force Damien had used. It was a powerful, grounding presence that felt like it was anchoring my soul to the earth. He began to move, his thrust deep and deliberate. Squelch, schlick. The sounds of our bodies colliding were visceral. The wet slapping of his balls against my perineum creating a rhythmic percussion. To our passion, I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him down so I could taste the salt of his skin. He picked up the pace, his movements becoming more urgent, more desperate. He wasn't just fucking me, he was worshipping me. Each thrust was a vow, each groan a confession. I could feel him hitting my cervix, a deep, blunt pressure that sent waves of ecstasy radiating through my lower belly. I love you, he groaned, his voice raw. I love you so much, Ethan. The words were the final trigger. I felt the tension coil tightly in my gut, a shimmering spring of pleasure that suddenly snapped. I convulsed around him, my internal muscles clamping tight on his cock in a series of rhythmic, pulsing contractions. I screamed his name, my entire body shaking as the orgasm ripped through me. A blinding explosion of light and heat. The feeling of my climax triggered his own. Adrian let out a loud, primal roar, his body stiffening as he delivered one final, deepest thrust. I felt the hot, thick jet of his seed erupting inside me, filling my womb with his warmth, a flood of alpha essence that marked me as his in the most intimate way possible. He collapsed on top of me, his breathing heavy and ragged, his heart hammering against my chest. We stayed like that for a long time, intertwined and slick with sweat and seed, the silence of the room filled only by the sound of our synchronized breathing. For the first time in 2 lives, I felt complete. I had a child who was loved, a partner who cherished me, and a peace that I had fought through hell to achieve. But as the days passed, the peace began to fray at the edges. It started with a phone call. A local business owner, a man who dealt with imports from the city, mentioned in passing that the Ashford Corporation was expanding its interests toward the coast. He spoke of it as a matter of economic growth, but to me, it sounded like a death knell. Then, I started seeing things. A black sedan, far too expensive for Silver Cove, idling at the end of the road. A stranger in a tailored suit standing on the pier, watching the archives with a clinical, detached intensity. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself that I was just paranoid, that Damien had finally moved on to Leo or someone else. But the memories of my past life, the way Damien hunted things he believed belonged to him, whispered in the back of my mind. One afternoon, I found a package on my doorstep. There was no return address, only my name written in a familiar, sharp, commanding script. I took the package inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. With trembling hands, I tore open the brown paper. Inside was a small, velvet box. I opened it to find a diamond necklace, a piece I recognized. It was the one Damien had given me on our first anniversary, the one I had left behind in the mausoleum of our home. Attached to the necklace was a small, cream-colored card. I found you, Ethan. The card didn't say I'm sorry. It didn't say I miss you. It was a statement of fact, a predator announcing that the scent had been picked up and the trail was hot. I dropped the necklace as if it were a poisonous snake. I sank to the floor, the cold tiles chilling my skin, as a wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over me. I looked toward the nursery where Noah was sleeping, and a fierce, protective rage flared in my chest. Damien didn't want me. He didn't want the love I had once given him. He wanted the idea of me, the obedient Omega who waited in the shadows. He wanted to reclaim a piece of property he had discarded. I felt a pair of strong arms wrap around me, pulling me up from the floor. Adrian was there, his scent flooding my senses, cutting through the panic. He had seen the card. He had seen the necklace. He's not taking you, Adrian said, his voice no longer soft. It was the voice of the man who crushed rivals, the voice of a powerful alpha who had found something more precious than any empire. He's not touching you, or Noah. He's coming, Adrian, I sobbed, clinging to him. He's actually coming. Let him come, Adrian replied, his silver eyes glowing with a cold, predatory light. I've spent my whole life fighting Damien Ashford in boardrooms and balance sheets. I think it's time we fought for something that actually matters. I leaned into him, the fear still there, but tempered by a new, hard resolve. I wasn't the fragile boy who had died in a cold apartment. I wasn't the spouse who had accepted a slap as a sign of affection. I looked at the necklace on the floor, the diamonds sparkling coldly in the dim light. In my previous life, this jewelry had been my golden cage. In this life, it was merely a piece of carbon. I walked over to the trash can and swept the necklace inside, burying it beneath the waste. The storm was no longer outside the house, it was at the door. But as I looked at Adrian, and then at the sleeping form of my son, I knew I was ready. I had spent a lifetime learning how to survive. Now, it was time to learn how to win. Chapter 4, The Collision of Two Worlds. The air in Silver Cove had changed. The salt spray breeze that once felt like a cleansing ritual now carried a metallic tang, a static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up. I could feel him. Even before I saw the black sedan idling at the edge of our gravel driveway, I could smell the sandalwood. It was a scent that had once been my entire world, a fragrance I had associated with safety and longing. Now, it smelled like a funeral pyre. I stood in the kitchen, my hands gripping the edge of the wooden counter so hard my knuckles turned white. Beside me, Noah was gurgling in his high chair, his small face smeared with mashed carrots, oblivious to the predator waiting outside. He was the picture of innocence, a bright, blinking light in the middle of a gathering storm. Adrian entered the room, his presence a grounding force that pulled me back from the ledge of a panic attack. He didn't say a word, he simply stepped behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me back against his chest. His sense eater, earth, and rain surged, an alpha's instinctive shield designed to mask my distress and warn the intruder that the territory was claimed. "He's here," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I know," Adrian replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Stay behind me, Ethan. You don't have to do this alone." We walked out onto the porch together. The afternoon sun was pale, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn. Standing by the car was Damien. He looked exactly as I remembered, yet entirely different. He was still the image of corporate perfection, the charcoal suit, the polished shoes, the jawline that could cut glass. But the arrogance that had always defined his posture was gone. In its place was something raw and jagged. His eyes, those gold-flecked alpha eyes, were bloodshot and frantic. He looked like a man who had been wandering a desert for a year and had finally spotted a mirage. The moment he saw me, he flinched. It wasn't a flinch of fear, but of shock. I knew what he saw. He didn't see the pale, trembling amiga who had begged for his scraps of affection. He didn't see the broken boy who had apologized for existing. He saw a man who was healthy, whose skin glowed with the vitality of a life lived in sunlight, whose eyes were clear and devoid of the desperation that had once defined them. "Ethan," he breathed. The word was a plea, a broken thing that barely sounded like his voice. He took a step forward, his hand reaching out as if to touch me, as if the mere gesture could erase the last year of silence. Adrian stepped forward, cutting off the path. He didn't shout. He didn't growl. He simply stood there, a wall of muscle and unwavering resolve, his silver eyes cold and predatory. The tension between the two alphas was immediate and suffocating, a clash of pheromones that felt like two thunderstorms colliding in a small space. "You're trespassing, Damien," Adrian said, his voice smooth and lethal. Damien didn't even look at him. His gaze was locked on me, searching my face for some sign of the old devotion, some flicker of the love that had once been his birthright. "I searched for you everywhere," Damien said, his voice growing stronger, tinged with that old, possessive edge. "I didn't understand why you left. I thought you were just hurt. I thought you needed time to realize that you can't survive without me." I felt a cold laugh bubble up in my chest, a sound that felt foreign and sharp. "Survive?" I asked, stepping out from behind Adrian, though I kept my hand firmly locked in his. "Damien, for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I am actually living." Damien froze. The mention of 2 lifetimes meant nothing to him, but the tone of my voice, the absolute lack of fear, seemed to rattle him. He looked at the way my hand was entwined with Adrian's, the way my body naturally leaned into the other alpha's warmth. "Who is he?" Damien demanded, his eyes finally snapping to Adrian. The gold in his iris flared. "Who the hell is this?" "The man who knows how to love me," I replied. Damien's expression shifted from shock to a simmering, dark rage. He stepped closer, the sandalwood scent becoming oppressive, attempting to dominate the air. "You think some small-town alpha can replace me? You think this charade is real? Ethan, look at me. You belong with me. You are in Ashford. I will take you home, and we will forget this little lapse in judgment." The arrogance of it was almost breathtaking. Even now, after a year of absence, he believed the world was a series of acquisitions. He believed I was a luxury asset that had simply been misplaced. Before I could respond, the screen door creaked open behind us. The nanny, a kind older woman from the village, stepped out with Noah in her arms. "I thought you might want the little one for a moment," she said softly. The world stopped. Damien's gaze dropped. He saw the child. He saw the soft, chubby cheeks, the tuft of dark hair, and the wide, curious eyes that were an exact mirror of my own. But as Noah shifted in the nanny's arms, the baby let out a small, instinctive sound, a soft, alpha-coded chirp of recognition, and reached his tiny hands toward Adrian. The silence that followed was absolute. I could see the moment the realization hit Damien. I could see the gears turning in his mind, the biological math calculating the timeline of my departure and the age of the child. Damien's face went ghostly pale. The rage vanished, replaced by a look of such profound, shattering horror that for a split second, I almost felt pity for him. Mine, he whispered, his voice trembling. He's mine. He lunged forward, a sudden, desperate movement to reach for the baby. In a blur of motion, Adrian was there. He didn't just block him, he shoved Damien back with a force that sent the CEO stumbling several feet, his polished shoes skidding in the gravel. Adrian stepped in front of me, and the baby, his shoulders broad, his presence an impenetrable fortress. "Don't you dare," Adrian growled, the sound coming from deep in his chest, a true alpha's warning. "Don't you dare touch him." Damien scrambled to his feet, his composure completely gone. He looked frantic, his eyes darting between me and the child. "He's my son, Ethan. Tell him. He's my blood." I looked at Damien, and I felt nothing. No anger, no hate, no love. Just a vast, empty space where a heart used to be. "He has a father," I said. My voice as cold as the Atlantic in January. "And it isn't you." Damien stopped. He looked at Adrian, then back at me, the truth sinking in. He realized that Adrian hadn't just found me, he had stepped into the void Damien had left. He had provided the protection, the love, and the stability that Damien had been too arrogant to offer. "You can't do this," Damien choked out. "I can give him everything. The Ashford Empire, the wealth, the status. He's an heir, he deserves the best." "He already has the best," I replied. "He has a father who loves him. He has a home where he is wanted. He has a life where he will never, ever have to beg for affection." Damien fell to his knees. It was a pathetic sight, the most powerful man in the city, reduced to a heap of charcoal wool and broken pride in a gravel driveway. He began to sob, the sounds raw and guttural, the sounds of a man who had finally realized he had burned down his own paradise and was now standing in the ashes. "I'm sorry," he gasped, his forehead touching the dirt. "Ethan, please. I didn't know. I didn't realize what I was losing. I love you. I've always loved you. I didn't know how to show it." I looked down at him. In my previous life, this would have been the moment I collapsed. I would have fallen to my knees beside him, believing that his tears were a sign of redemption. I would have let him pull me back into the golden cage, convinced that this time, things would be different. But I remember the gray ceiling. I remember the smell of antiseptic. I remember the feeling of my child slipping away while Damien was comforting Leo. "You don't love me, Damien," I said softly. "You love the way I loved you. You love the feeling of being worshipped. But you never loved me. You loved the mirror I held up to you, reflecting back a version of yourself that was kind and generous." I stepped closer, looking down at the man who had once been my god. "The mirror is broken, Damien, and there is nothing left for you here." Damien looked up, his eyes pleading, searching for a sliver of mercy. "Please, just let me see him. Let me hold him once." I looked at Noah, who was now chewing on his own fist, looking at the strange, crying man with a detached, baby-like curiosity. I thought about the trauma of my past, the cycles of pain that had defined my existence. "No," I said. The word was a gavel. The case was closed. Adrian stepped forward, his hand resting firmly on my shoulder. "Get off our property, Damien," Adrian commanded. "If you ever come back, if you ever try to contact Ethan or Noah, I won't just push you. I will dismantle every single thing you've ever built. I will buy your company piece by piece and burn it to the ground just to ensure you have nothing left to distract you from the memory of what you threw away." It wasn't an empty threat. Damien knew it. He knew that Adrian Knight was the only man in the world with the resources and the ruthlessness to actually do it. Damien stayed on his knees for a long time, the silence of the cove closing in around him. Eventually, he stood up. He didn't look at us again. He walked back to his car, his movement slow and hollow, like a ghost returning to its grave. As the black sedan disappeared down the driveway, the static in the air finally vanished. The salt spray breeze returned, cool and refreshing. I leaned back into Adrian, my body shaking with a sudden, violent release of tension. I didn't cry. I just breathed. I breathed in the scent of cedar and rain, the scent of a man who had seen the worst of me and decided I was worth everything. Adrian turned me around, his arms wrapping around me in a crushing embrace. He kissed my forehead, his lips warm and lingering. "It's over," he whispered. "He's gone." "Is it really over?" I asked, clutching his shirt. "Yes," Adrian replied, pulling back to look me in the eyes. "Because this time, you aren't the one running. You are the one who stayed. And I'm the one who's never letting go." I looked over at Noah, who had managed to get a smudge of carrot on his nose. I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. I had spent 2 lifetimes waiting for someone to choose me. I had spent years believing that love was something you earned through obedience and sacrifice. But as I stood there in the pale sunlight of Silver Cove, held by a man who loved me without conditions, I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't anger or pain. The greatest revenge was happiness. I walked back into the house, the screen door clicking shut behind me, leaving the ghost of the Ashford Empire to fade into the mist of the Atlantic. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The future was inside the house, smelling of baby powder and cedarwood. And for the first time in my existence, I knew exactly where I belonged. Chapter 5. The Architecture of Peace. The silence that followed Damien's departure was not the hollow, ringing silence of the foyer after a slap. It was a heavy, fertile silence, the kind that follows a summer storm, where the air is scrubbed clean and the earth breathes in deep, damp gulps of relief. For days, I existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the legal summons or the midnight knock that would signal the return of my nightmare. But the knock never came. I learned through the grapevine of the coastal town, and through the occasional filtered reports from Adrian's business associates, that the Ashford Empire had begun to fracture. It turned out that the fragile Leo had not been nearly as loyal as Damien had believed. In the vacuum of my absence, Leo had spent the last year quietly siphoning funds and forging signatures, preparing to step over Damien's corpse the moment he showed a sign of weakness. The moment Damien had spiraled into his obsessive search for me, his grip on the corporation had loosened. Leo had attempted a coup, but he had underestimated one thing: Adrian Knight. Adrian didn't just threaten to dismantle the Ashford Empire. He began to do it with surgical precision. He didn't buy the company for the profit. He bought the debts, the liabilities, and the loyalty of the board members, effectively turning Damien into a ghost in his own halls. Damien had been stripped of his power, not by a rival's greed, but by the consequences of his own cruelty. He had built his world on a foundation of dominance and indifference, and when the one person who had truly loved him disappeared, the foundation had crumbled. Leo had been discarded, caught in his own web of embezzlement and cast out into the cold, just as Damien had once cast me out. I felt a flicker of satisfaction, but it was a distant, cold thing. The revenge I had craved in the echoes of my past life, the desire to see him suffer, felt small now. The true victory wasn't seeing Damien fall. It was the fact that I no longer cared whether he lived or died. He had become a footnote in the story of my life, a smudge of gray on a canvas that was now filled with vibrant, living color. The memories of the other life finally stopped screaming. They faded into a dull hum, then into a whisper, and finally they vanished altogether. The gray hospital ceiling, the smell of antiseptic, the crushing weight of loneliness, they were replaced by the smell of cedarwood, the sound of Noah's laughter, and the feeling of Adrian's hand in mine. One evening, as the first frost began to lace the edges of the windows, Adrian and I found ourselves alone in the living room. Noah had fallen asleep in his nursery, his breathing a soft, rhythmic tide that echoed the ocean outside. The fire was a roaring beast in the hearth, casting amber light across the room, turning the mahogany furniture into liquid gold. I was sitting on the rug, leaning against the sofa, watching the flames. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of gratitude, a weight in my chest that felt like a physical pressure. I had been given a second chance, not just at life, but at love. Adrian stepped into my line of sight, his presence a warm shadow. He reached down, his large hand sliding under my arms to lift me up and pull me against him. His scent was thick and intoxicating, a heady mix of rain-dampened earth and something uniquely him, a spicy, warm musk that made my omega instincts purr with contentment. "You're thinking again," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that I felt in my very marrow. "I'm just happy," I whispered, tilting my head back to look at him. "I didn't think this was possible. I didn't think I deserved this." Adrian's expression hardened, his silver eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce intensity. He cupped my face in his hands, his thumb stroking my cheekbones with a tenderness that made my eyes sting. "Don't ever say that," he commanded softly. "You deserve every breath of air in this house. You deserve every ounce of love I have to give. You are the strongest person I have ever known, Ethan." He leaned down and kissed me, a slow, deep exploration that tasted of red wine and longing. I melted into him, my hand sliding up his chest to grip the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer as if I could fuse our skin together. The kiss shifted, growing hungrier, more desperate. It wasn't the desperate hunger of two people afraid of loss, but the celebratory hunger of two people who had finally found their home. He lifted me, my legs wrapping instinctively around his waist, and carried me toward the bedroom. The door clicked shut, sealing us away from the world, leaving only the two of us and the shimmering heat of our desire. He laid me back on the bed, the linen cool against my skin as he stripped me with an urgency that made my breath hitch. He peeled away my clothes, his eyes roaming over my body with a hunger that felt like a physical touch. He paused at my chest, his gaze lingering on the softness of my skin, before he leaned down to take one nipple into his mouth. I let out a sharp, guttural moan, my fingers digging into his shoulders. He sucked hard, his tongue swirling around the peak, creating a vacuum of pleasure that sent sparks shooting straight to my clit. He moved his mouth lower, his kisses trailing a path of fire down my stomach, pausing to press a lingering, reverent kiss to the faint silver lines on my hips. "You are perfect," he groaned against my skin. He moved between my thighs, his large hands prying them wide. He didn't rush. He spent an eternity using his tongue to worship me, his laps long and wet, circling my clit with a rhythmic precision that had me bucking against the mattress. The sound of it, the wet, sloppy squelching of his tongue against my drenched folds filled the quiet room, a visceral symphony of lust. I was shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Adrian, please. I need you. Now." He looked up at me, his silver eyes dark, his pupils blown wide with alpha heat. He stripped off his own clothes, in one fluid motion, revealing a body that was a masterpiece of lean muscle and raw power. He positioned himself at my entrance. He paused for a heartbeat, his gaze locked on mine, ensuring I was with him. Then, with one slow, relentless thrust, he buried himself inside me. He began to move, his thrust deep and punishingly slow. "You're mine," he growled, his voice a raw, animal sound. "My omega. My everything." The words triggered a surge of heat in my lower belly, a shimmering coil of tension that began to tighten. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him down so I could taste the salt of his skin, my tongue tracing the line of his jaw. He picked up the pace, his movements becoming more frantic, more visceral. The friction was intense, the wetness of our joined bodies creating a slick, sliding sensation that drove me toward the edge. I could feel the pressure building, a tidal wave of pleasure that was about to crash over me. "I love you," I cried out, my voice breaking. "I love you, Adrian." The confession was the final trigger. I felt my climax hit a blinding, electric explosion that ripped through my entire frame. My internal walls convulsed in powerful, rhythmic pulses, clamping down on his cock with a desperate intensity. I arched my back, my toes curling, as wave after wave of orgasm crashed over me, leaving me gasping and shattered. The feeling of my release triggered his own. Adrian let out a primal roar, his body stiffening as he delivered one final, deepest thrust, pinning me to the mattress. I felt the hot, thick jet of his seed erupting inside me, a flood of alpha essence that filled my womb, marking me and claiming me in the most intimate way possible. He groaned, his forehead resting against mine, his breathing heavy and ragged as he spent himself inside me. We lay there for a long time, intertwined and slick with sweat and seed, the scent of our union thick in the air. It was a scent of completion, of belonging. As the years passed, Silver Cove remained our sanctuary. Noah grew from a gurgling infant into a spirited toddler, then a curious young boy with a laugh that could brighten the darkest winter morning. He grew up knowing only one kind of love, a love that was patient, gentle, and unwavering. He never knew the shadow of the Ashford name, nor the coldness of a father who viewed children as heirs rather than human beings. I continued my work at the archives, eventually becoming the head archivist after Mrs. Gable retired. I spent my days preserving the history of the town, but my true legacy was the life I had built within the walls of my stone cottage. I often thought about the man I had been in that other life, the broken, desperate boy who had died in the dark. I felt a profound sense of distance from him, as if he were a character in a book I had read a long time ago. I didn't hate him, and I didn't pity him. Instead, I thanked him, because his suffering had been the catalyst for my awakening. His death had been the price of my rebirth. One autumn afternoon, when Noah was 5 years old, we walked along the cliffs together. The wind was brisk, carrying the scent of salt and decaying leaves. Noah was running ahead of us, his small boots crunching on the gravel, his laughter echoing against the gray stone of the cliffs. Adrian walked beside me, his arm draped securely round my shoulders, pulling me into his side. I leaned into him, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice as warm and grounding as it had been the first day we met. I looked out at the horizon, where the gray Atlantic met the gray sky in a seamless line of infinity. I thought about the slap, the betrayal, the loneliness, and the long, hard road that had led me here. I thought about the man who had tried to own me, and the man who had chosen to love me. I smiled, a slow, peaceful expression that reached my eyes. "I was just thinking," I said, leaning my head against his shoulder, "that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The wind picked up, swirling around us, but I didn't feel the cold. I was wrapped in the warmth of a love that had been forged in fire, and tempered in the salt of the sea. I was no longer a ghost, no longer a victim, and no longer a possession. I was Ethan Vale. I was a father. I was a partner. I was free. And as Noah turned back to us, waving his small hand and shouting for us to hurry up, I knew that the architecture of my peace was finally complete. The foundations were strong, the walls were built of trust, and the roof was a sky that no longer felt like it was falling. For the first time into lifetimes, I was home.